I'll walk you in. Far left, right near the 7. Inside the 7 ring, right on the board of the 8. Headshot. Headshot.
All right, guys, Merce here, and today we're going to talk about this. A 1938 Swedish Mauser, chambered in 6.5 Swede. Now, before we get too deep into this rifle, we are going to talk about a little bit of history, so go ahead and grab a drink and join me on this little jaunt. So, in the mid-1930s, Sweden began to realize that war was on the horizon and they might get embroiled in it. So, they decided that they needed to refine their rifle concept. Now, at this point, they were using both the 1894 carbine and the 1896 long rifle. And what was decided was that they should go to a short rifle concept, an intermediate length rifle. This way they would streamline production, only have to produce one pattern, and then everyone would be able to utilize it. And this is actually a very common trend for the time period and even predates World War I, with the United States adoption in the 1903, the British adoption of the short magazine Lee Enfield. Same kind of concept. One rifle that could be used by cavalry, mechanized troops, rear echelon guys, as well as your frontline infantry. Now, by 1938, they'd more or less standardized on what the pattern was going to be, but by that time, World War II was heating up. So what they decided to do was to take a large number of their 1896 long rifles, about 55,000 of them, and cut them down to the short rifle pattern. These are referred colloquially by collectors as either the 9638 or the Type 1 rifles. And you can pick them out from across the room by having a straight bolt handle, but that's not the only identifying feature, and we'll talk about that as we go through the features of this rifle. Now, I say that as a colloquial term because the Swedish military did not recognize the difference between the Type 1s and the Type 2s as they were referred to. They just saw 1938 pattern rifles, and that's all that they saw. That's all that they called them. That's all that they referred to them as. They did not make a distinction between a 96 being cut down or a 1938 being produced at all. Now, throughout the production life, the purpose-built 1938s numbered about 88,000-ish, and their production would cease in 1944 with the adoption of the AG-42 semi-automatic rifle, with a grand total of just under 150,000 rifles produced. Now, these rifles would be very popular for service rifle type competitions and have continued to thrive for that all throughout Europe, Canada, Australia, all that kind of stuff. A lot of places where this era of rifle are still used in competitive circles, this rifle definitely stands out. Now, this has also been used quite heavily for hunting in Scandinavia as well as the rest of Europe, and it has been very successful in that regard, having dropped some of the larger game like red deer, caribou, brown bear, and also some use on African plains game. Now, that pretty much covers our history overall on the rifle. Let's go ahead and talk about this rifle specifically. This is a 1941 dated 1938 Type 2, you see from the turn down bolt handle. We have a 23.5 inch barrel, and at the end of our barrel you see that we have this threading. Now, this is 14x1 threading, but it was not set up for a suppressor. This was actually for the mounting of a blank firing device. Now, the Swedes would employ a wooden bullet blank. My only real guess can be to better simulate the actual recoil of firing a live cartridge. However, they didn't necessarily want anyone to get injured by these wooden bullets, so they would come up with a blank firing adapter that pretty much worked like a wood chipper and would chunk up that bullet as it attempted to exit the bore. Now, you also see here that we have an unprotected front sight, which seems to be the standard on the 96 and the 38, but the 1941 Sniper, I have seen quite a few of those with front sight hoods in place. And I do know that you can get front sight hoods to fit on these rifles. I think that is a non-military standard adaptation for target shooting. Now also, these front sights, you'll find a variety of different heights in relation to millimeters. This is a 1.0, and I have seen them up to 1.75 millimeter front sights. You can also get a front sight adjustment tool so that you can do your windage adjustments on the front sight. So pretty much all accuracy adjustments are done off of the front sight on this rifle with the installation of different front sights. Now, you'll see that we also have a cleaning rod attached here, and we also have a stacking hole set into the front retainer there, which if a bunch, like a squad of Swedish soldiers wanted to stack their rifles, they would take one fella's cleaning rod, run it through the hole, and then get everyone else's rifles online with it. Pretty interesting little concept. I like the use of the space. Now, this is also where our bayonet lug resides, and I happen to have a Swedish 1896 pattern bayonet, the second version of this pattern. Now, you can tell that it is a second version because the second version has this conical shape to the actual locking lug for the bayonet. The base of this is hollow so that it fits over top of the cleaning rod, and then it clips right in to the bayonet lug. Now, these are actually very interesting because obviously with that hollow grip design, they have what is referred to as a split tang, and it's very short. And I would have assumed, just based off of my very limited amount of knowledge on knives, that a split tang design like this would actually be extremely weak and prone to breakage. But from what I understand, these are actually very stout bayonets, and they are seldom seen broken or snapped in half. Like, I would automatically assume that just after a little bit of bayonet practice, this thing would be snapped off right here at the hilt and would be completely useless. But apparently they're actually a very successful design. Now, something else to designate between the Type 1 and the Type 2 of these bayonets will be the amount of time put into the checkering. This is a very light checkering, and the actual Type 1s had a very aggressive checkering. All right, we'll take this thing off of here before I poke my eye out. These bayonets are not that hard to find. They run about $90 in the condition that you see this one here, which has both the sheath and the leather frog that goes along with it. You can get them a lot cheaper if you're willing to give up the sheath or the frog, but I was not, because I wanted the whole setup. Can't help myself. I like the collecting aspect of these rifles. Now, as we move down the rifle, you'll also see that we have a handguard, which is pretty fantastic for Swedish soldiers who don't want to burn their fingies in the middle of battle. We also have finger cutouts here in the stock, which is great for being able to pull that rifle into the shoulder. I like it. I'm a huge fan. Our rear sight is graduated from 100 out to 600 meters. And really, if you look at it in comparison to a lot of other rifles from this period, there's not a lot of movement in that sight, making its changes from 100 out to 600. And that plays into the fact that these are extremely flat shooting rifles. We'll get more into shooting once we get there, but that's a tell of things to come. Now, the actual proof acceptance mark is on the rear sight on these rifles. You can see there that is a little tilted crown, which is an indicator of Swedish manufacture, of which all of the 1938s were, but not all of the 1896s were. However, that's a video for a different day. Now, coming back to our chamber, we see that we have Husqvarna markings where all of the Type 2 or the original 1938s were produced. You would have another manufacturer if this was a converted 1896. And then we also have our date, 1941. Now, this is the 1893 Mauser action. So this is a cock on close. So we can see there, our cocking piece comes to the rear cocked position whenever we bring the bolt back into the battery. We also have our oversized Mauser claw extractor. We have a cutout for Mauser strip clips, of which I have a baggie of 20. And then we also have our thumb cut out so we can get the ammunition all the way down into our internal box magazine. Right here, this little lever is what allows us to remove the bolt. Our safety is on the back here with the cocking piece. Go ahead and cock it. All right, here we are in the cocked position. Right now the weapon is on fire with the Mauser type flag safety all the way to the left. In the center position, I cannot pull the trigger. The trigger is disconnected. However, I can still operate the bolt to be able to remove ammunition if I see so fit. And then all the way to the right position, locks or disengages the hammer and locks the bolt. Now, we have knurling on this cocking piece, and this was so that Swedish soldiers could put a bit of leather here if they wanted to do dry fire practice so as to not damage the firing pin. Now, as far as I can tell, this is an all numbers matching gun. However, I do notice that somebody, that might be difficult to see, I'll try to roll in a picture of it. Somebody has electro stenciled the last 3 of the serial number in a couple of different locations. And I cannot decide if that was done by an armorer trying to make sure that perhaps some of these parts that are not serialized stayed with the gun, or if somebody was really trying to drive home the fact that this is an all numbers matching gun on the second-hand market. I really think it's the second option, and it kind of annoys me, but it happens. Unfortunately, it happens. We do have a single stage trigger. It's a pretty good mil-spec trigger, I guess you could say. We do have a last shot hold open, which a lot of people might consider that to be something only associated with modern weapon systems, but as it turns out, militaries of old still wanted their soldiers to know when the gun was empty so that they weren't sitting there dry firing in the middle of battle because they're scared out of their wits and all they hear is gunfire. Now you'll see that we have a very straight shape to our stock, which is not my preferred, but I'll let it go for this rifle. Now we have a steel butt plate. Our sling swivels are intact, and this is a period collect sling, even though I did have to do a little bit of repair work to it in order to be able to mount it. Now, this is one of the parts that I find to be the most interesting. This is our stock disc, and what this does is it's kind of a report card. Now, this is the later version that you'll find on the Type 2 rifles, which is a single screw set in the center. There is an earlier version which was 2 screws more widely spaced apart, and all that was on that disc was just the information of what unit it belonged to, what rifle number out of all that stack, all that kind of stuff. That's what that information was told. However, this here has had divots punched in over some correlating numbers, and what it basically tells us is point of impact at 100 meters, what ammunition this rifle was zeroed with, or what that point of impact correlates to, as well as our bore condition. Now, something that you have to keep in mind with these guys is that these stock discs are sold clean out on the market. You can go out and buy like probably a packet of these stock discs that have all this information not yet punched into it, and then you can install this in the stock of literally any gun and say that the bore condition or whatever it is that you want it to say. So if you're looking at one of these on the internet and you're looking at the stock disc and it's all ups, everything about it is a great thing, I would caution you to be very concerned about that. In general, I try to make sure that I have an opportunity to inspect used guns before I go purchasing them. I do not like ordering used guns off the internet because I can't necessarily verify whether or not someone's giving me the straight scoop on the condition, and that's not okay with me. So to keep in mind, guys, you can get these discs to put in there, and that's all because these were graded by an armorer or a depot, you know, whatever their schedules were for that. So those stock discs would be changed out quite frequently. If the bore degraded, then they would reflect that on the stock disc, and that way they could look through and know which guns need to be re-bore scoped or perhaps re-barreled. That's why this is important. That's also why it's so interesting. Now, how does this rifle shoot?
Ring on the left side. Dead center in the red. 8-ring on the right. 8-ring on the right.
I absolutely love taking this thing to the range. The 6.5mm Swedish is a very mild recoiling cartridge, and it is very flat shooting. I've had no problem taking this rifle out to 400 yards and just ring steel all day long. It's almost boring how accurate it is. Now, when it comes to shooting it on paper, I would not necessarily say that it is not reflective of the accuracy that you actually get in practical situations, shooting steel or something along those lines. On paper, this gun at best groups about 3 inches, maybe a little less. So I don't know how much more you could ask for out of an iron-sighted World War II era Mauser. I mean, that's probably about what you're going to get, and that's still minute-of-man accuracy. It's perfectly acceptable. Now, what do I use this rifle for? Well, this is a collector's rifle for me, if I'm being completely honest. I absolutely love, even though this wasn't necessarily involved in combat or anything along those lines, I still love collecting military surplus rifles, and this is a fantastic option here to collect. I would like to take this out and hunt some deer with it. I did not realize I was still going to be in the country this year and able to do that. So hopefully next year I'll get a chance to get out in the field and take some deer with this. That is absolutely something that I want to do with it. Now, what do I recommend you do with it? Well, to some extent, that kind of depends on where you live. If you live here in the United States, this is a great investment opportunity. These rifles probably came in fairly cheap, but now they're over $500. So they're only going to appreciate from there, and there's no better time than now to go ahead and grab one. For a defensive type rifle, end of the world, or home defense type rifle, specifically in a home defense type rifle, I think this is entirely too powerful, depending on where you live. If you live in the suburbs, you're definitely going to wind up shooting your neighbor by accident if you wind up using this in a home defense type scenario. If you live out in the country, maybe it's a little more useful, but it's not exactly readily adaptable to lights or lasers or optics, whatever it is that you want to throw on it. So maybe not its best use for that. As a end of the world, fighting rifle type deal, I would not default to this. There are better options out on the market. At best, this is like a loaner gun for that type of purpose. Now, hunting rifle, absolutely. Now, some people might take issue with trying to hunt with iron sights. I do not. I enjoy the challenge aspect of it, but somebody else might. Now, there are aftermarket attachments that you can get that would attach to this rear sight, and you could use a scout scope type setup, a long relief, low power optic scope type setup with it. However, I would implore you to do a lot of research on those optics mounts, because a lot of them are kind of garbage, if I'm being completely honest, and have a tendency to lose zero and all that kind of stuff. So I would really spend a lot of time researching that optic mount before I put any of my hard-earned money into it. Now, as a competition rifle for military type shooting sports, I would heavily think on this rifle for that purpose, for a couple of reasons. Now, there are actually still a ton of different sight options that you can get for this rifle. You can get different graduations on the rear sight. You can also get a rear sight adaptation that'll plug in right where the screw hole is, that is more fine than what these notch rear sights are going to give you. So there's actually quite a bit of adaptability out there for this rifle for those type of shooting sports, and I think this would be a definite good use for that rifle. All right, now I'll go ahead and give you guys my final thoughts on this particular rifle. I absolutely love Swedish Mausers, and there's a very good reason for that. And we see it in this bayonet as well. So all Swedish Mausers were built using Swedish steel. Now, what is unclear is if that was just kind of like a national identity type thing, that even when the original 1896s were built in Germany, they still wanted their native steel to be used to create them. However, what has been found, if that's the case, then I mean, cool. It turns out that they lucked out, because that's been found in hindsight. Swedish steel has excellent concentrations of some very positive properties that makes it absolutely amazing for corrosion resistance. High concentrations of things like vanadium and some other minerals or steel attributes that just make it excellent steel. I have yet to find a Swedish Mauser that I would grade poorly. Now, I've seen some that for Swedish Mausers are not in the best condition. They got a little bit of rust. This rifle in particular has just a touch of rust on its buttstock. But for the most part, I don't see a lot of pitting. I don't necessarily see bores in terrible condition. And I don't see a lot of rust popping up in them, especially in any of the finished metal pieces. And this bayonet is a fantastic example of a lot of the same, where yes, it's beaten up. It's definitely something that is, you know, a little older. It's been around since the 1930s for sure, maybe the 1940s. However, it's in excellent overall condition. I cannot vouch for how this was stored or how it's been kept, but I can vouch for the fact that it's in excellent working order, that it does everything that it's supposed to do. That's what I love about Swedish Mausers in general, because not all military surplus rifles can say that. I have yet to see a good-looking Spanish Mauser. Just being completely honest, all of them, the wood's in terrible condition, there's lots of pitting and rust and all that kind of stuff, whereas I have yet to see a crappy Swedish Mauser. So if you're looking for an investment opportunity and a rifle that's most definitely only going to appreciate, this is where you ought to be looking. All right, guys. Well, that's pretty much what I got for the moment. I hope you guys found this educational. So, have a good day.